What if Germany won the Battle of Stalingrad? In our own timeline, Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1939, in which they partitioned Eastern Europe between themselves, starting with Poland. However, in 1941 Germany invaded the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa. The Germans were defeated in Moscow due to winter, but would launch Case Blue the next year. The offensive came to a halt in Stalingrad, modern-day Volgograd, and from there the Soviets started to push the Germans back until 1945 when they took Berlin. But what if that didn't happen? What if Germany won the Battle of Stalingrad? In this timeline, Operation Uranus ends in disaster and the Soviets fail to encircle the Germans, and the Germans manage to take the whole city. Unfortunately for the Germans, the city was destroyed to 99%, so they didn't gain much. The Germans would then reach the Caspian Sea and push the Soviets all the way to the Caucasus Mountains. The Caucasus mountain range is the greatest mountain range in all of Europe, and the Germans are getting overextended. Furthermore, the Soviets can still supply the front line through Iran, which they and the British conquered in 1941. Not only didn't the Germans get the Baku oil fields, but the existing ones like in Grozny were already destroyed, so they didn't really manage to improve their situation. The Germans would launch a summer operation in 1943 that came to halt in Moscow for a second time. But fortunately for the Germans, Leningrad fell. Unfortunately for the Germans, the Allies landed in North Africa and pushed the Germans and Italians out. In the winter between 1943 and 1944, the Soviets destroyed the Germans, who were trying to take over Moscow. The front line in the south and north manifested along rivers and lakes, namely the Volga and Don River, or the Rybinsk and Ladoga River. In 1944, Allied forces landed in Italy, beginning a brutal civil war that stalemates. At the same time, the Soviets defeat the Germans at the Battle of Saratov and begin to liberate the Caucasus. By 1945, the liberation of the Caucasus region was completed, and at the same time the Allies landed in Normandy and later southern France. In summer 1945, the Allies nuked Nuremberg and Dresden, but the Germans refused to surrender. However, their allies Bulgaria, Finland, and Romania do surrender. The backstab from Romania caused the collapse of the southern front, and the Germans were forced to withdraw out of Ukraine. The Western Allies also liberate Greece and Yugoslavia, and face the Germans in Hungary. In 1946, American forces land in Japan, and after intense fighting with a lot of casualties, the Japanese government surrenders. In 1946, seeing that Germany doesn't surrender, the Allies launch new nuclear attacks, but this time focused on military targets like airfields, ports, military bases. The German army is starting to lose faith, and German armies, especially in the south and west, begin to surrender. The Soviets are also making advances in the east, as Germany has to replace its forces in the west. In mid-1946, the Allies capture Berlin, and in early 1947 Königsberg, ending the war in Europe as well. American and Soviet forces meet somewhere at around where the German invasion of the Soviet Union begun. This war was more brutal for everyone. 2 more years of fighting lead to more American and British casualties. Japan suffered in downfall, and nuking 2 cities would probably be more humane. The Soviets suffered even harder under the Nazis, and Germany faces twice the casualties from OTL due to the nukes, and is even more destroyed. The overall casualties are over 100 million and could be as high as 150 million, so 6 times the First World War. The Second World War is even more brutal and even more of a tragedy than it was in our own timeline. The Western Allies and Soviet meet somewhere where the war begun, so the Soviets didn't make any gains, but the Allies still held territories in Ukraine through Romania and Karelia through Finland, and they were able to negotiate the release of Kresy and the Baltics for these lands and some money. After the destruction of much of the Soviet Union, and a lot of casualties, they even lost land. Bulgaria was forced to return its occupied territories, with the exception being southern Dobruja. Romania was allowed to keep Bessarabia, and Finland got its pre-Winter War borders. Hungary had to return all of its gains from the war, and a democracy was put in charge. Albania too became a democracy, with the monarch, King Zogu, losing a lot of power. Yugoslavia, however, liberated itself and still becomes communist under Josip Broz Tito. The West feared it might align itself with the Soviets, but that was quickly proven not to be the case. The pre-war government of Czechoslovakia and Poland would be restored, and Poland also got the areas in Upper Silesia that voted to remain a part of Germany after the First World War in our own timeline, and all of East Prussia. In Germany, given that the Allies don't want to re-establish a big Germany, Germany was split into three. Austria, Bavaria and Baden-Württemberg become the Danubian Federation under Otto von Habsburg, and the north becomes the Federal Republic of Germany under Kurt Schumacher. The lands west of the Rhine become an international zone that eventually becomes its own country. France also separated the Saarland, but it would join the Rhenish Republic. Italy in this timeline also loses South Tyrol, as the Allies aren't as worried about communism as in our own timeline. In East Asia, all of Japan and all of Korea are under American occupation, and in both pro-American governments are established. Japan also contains South Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands. In China, without a Soviet invasion of Manchuria, the communists lose the civil war, and the nationalists Kuomintang under Chiang Kai-shek unify China. In Iran, given that they got nothing and its importance in the Second World War, the Soviets don't withdraw out of the north and establish a puppet regime under Iraj Eskandari of the Tuna Party. This, however, backfired, as it legitimized the pro-Western Shah, who was able to center power under himself and establish an absolute monarchy even without help from the CIA. Furthermore, this caused an anti-Soviet sentiment in the Middle East, as they are now seen as just as bad as the West. Given how weak the Soviets are, a Cold War might not even happen. The United States could even return to its tradition of isolationism. Capitalist Europe, however, which was also destroyed, would be forced to cooperate and form an Entente alliance to deter the Soviet Union. This Entente would be led by France, as the United Kingdom had little interest in European affairs. France also sponsors a coup against the Francoist regime and installs Diego Martínez Barrio of the center-left Republican Union as the president of the Third Spanish Republic. This Third Spanish Republic also joins the Entente. France and the United Kingdom would still try to hold on to their colonies, but without success. On the other hand, without America and a weak Soviet Union, they managed to take the Suez Canal from Egypt. Israel annexes the Gaza Strip and Sinai Peninsula, while the British and French take the Suez Canal. This plummets support for Gamal Abdel Nasser, and that same year monarchists would launch a counter-coup, and Fuad II is reinstated as the King of Egypt. The monarchists are more friendly with the West. They negotiated the return of the Suez, but with continued British and French oversight. Furthermore, Sudan became a condominium between the United Kingdom and Egypt again, and when the British left Sudan, it became a part of Egypt. The people of South Sudan would still rise up against the government, but without any success. Arab socialism in Egypt was a failure, and it wouldn't spread. Tunisia, Libya, Iraq, and Yemen are still monarchies. Libya would be, without sanctions from the West, be like a Gulf state, and one of the wealthiest countries of the world. Iraq is still part of the Arab Federation, which eventually federalizes. It is also possible that Syria might at one point join it. North Yemen might still unify with South Yemen, but a war never happens. Furthermore, no Arab-Israeli wars happen and relations eventually normalize, but the Sinai Peninsula and Gaza Strip could be a topic of contention. The oil crisis also wouldn't happen. The Soviets would build their first nuke in 1957, but the British already built theirs in 1954, and the French would build theirs in 1960. Cuba still becomes communist, but the Soviets distance themselves from Cuba as not to invoke the Americans, and so Cuba becomes pro-American again. The Indochina War also results in an anti-communist victory, with Ngo Dinh Diem in charge of Vietnam, and Laos and Cambodia remain monarchies. In 1975, Chiang Kai-shek dies and Chiang Ching-kuo becomes president, followed by Lee Teng-hui in 1988, under whom China becomes a democracy. Korea and Vietnam also democratize around that time. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapses, and the individual Soviet republics gain independence. North Iran would join South Iran, which liberalized after the death of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. Mongolia could either remain independent or fall to China. which would still take Macau and Hong Kong and would start to become the most dominant power in the old world with the biggest GDP. Without radical Islamism, 9/11 and the war on terror don't happen. Russia still invades Ukraine in 2022, and it still becomes a stalemate. In this timeline, the Soviet Union was massively weakened due to German control over the West, and the Soviets won nothing. Meanwhile, the United States left the international stage, and a democratic China is the greatest power in the old world. If you liked the episode, leave a like, and don't forget to subscribe. Goodbye.